Welcome to On the Line Media. I'm your host, Samira Moyedin. Coming up is my conversation with Palestinian-Canadian lawyer, Ms. Diana Buttu. Now, I spoke with Ms. Buttu from Ramallah on June 4th. This is about a month before the student encampment at the University of Toronto was issued a court injunction authorizing the police to dismantle the encampment. The University of Toronto is both my alma mater and Ms. Buttu's, and we both were in the Middle Eastern Studies department. I asked Ms. Buttu what it meant to her to see more than 183 student encampments worldwide in solidarity with Palestine. I hope you enjoy the conversation. Diana Buttu, thank you so much for joining me on the program.
Thank you, Samira.
It's so strange to be speaking to you in the flesh. I've never spoken to you sort of eye to eye because I've spent so many years booking you, pre-interviewing you while I was at the CBC, but I'm so thrilled to be able to speak to you face to face.
Thank you, Samira. It's also a delight to chat with you face to face, although we're, through not in the same country, obviously.
Yeah, I'm just speaking of that, the CBC, there was this big article in The Breach. I'm not sure if you saw it. And there was a whistleblower speaking and saying that you are one of the guests that the CBC has put on this sort of unofficial blacklist of people not to speak to. You're a Palestinian Canadian.
Yes.
And I know that I've booked you many times on the program that I used to work at, but how does that make you feel knowing that you're on this quote unquote, secret blacklist?
Samira, I actually had a feeling that there was such a blacklist for quite some time. And the reason is that from October, I was on the CBC once or twice in October, and then wasn't heard from. I didn't hear from them again, not through the attack on a Shifa hospital, not through the period of this entire period of the genocide, but then specific moments where you would expect that they would want to hear a legal perspective. For example, when the South Africans brought the case before the ICJ, I was one of the people who went to the ICJ the first time around back in 2004. No call from the CBC then. Then again, when the provisional measures order came out, no call from the CBC then. And so I had the feeling that there was such a blacklist. Now, how does it make me feel? It confirms my belief that as much as people want to think that Canadian media is fair, it's actually not. It's very much in favor of a Zionist narrative. The Canadian media has gone out of their way to make this genocide justifiable, even though no genocide is justifiable. And you can see that in many ways, the Canadian media tends to be much worse than some of the U.S. media that people like to complain about. So while people pride themselves on having a media that is fair, that is balanced, that is providing perspectives of people who are actually living through genocide, through war, etc., it's a media that tends to be parroting the voices of Israeli officials and of government and of those who are in favor of a genocide. And so, again, it's not. I wasn't surprised by this, but clearly there's a lot of work that needs to be done, and clearly people need to raise their voices and ask the question of the CBC and of other Canadian outlets, by the way, of why is it that we're not hearing Palestinian voices during this period?
One of the things that I noticed is that whenever we did hear from Palestinians on the program, it was always what I started calling about the feels. As you're being starved, or as your mom died or your kid was killed, it was always, how are you feeling? What's around you? Like, there was never. Palestinians were not brought on the air to provide analysis or expertise. It was always about, how you doing? When was your last meal?
Yeah.
And this is something that I've seen happen a lot. How do you explain that, considering all of the sort of political analysts that are Palestinian or historians, how their voices don't get brought up to give expertise on these events?
It's dehumanizing. It's dehumanizing because it's as though we don't have a perspective that's worthy of sharing. It's as though we don't have a perspective that's worthy of others connecting with and sharing with. And when you turn Palestinians into simply a humanitarian case, well, it's so tragic and we can just wash our hands of it, or in a best case scenario, we can just throw some money at it. We as Palestinians, this isn't a humanitarian issue. It's a political issue that's been turned into, that has humanitarian ramifications. But when you take the perspective that this is just a humanitarian issue, this is just a question of climate change and something that we have no ability to affect when we actually can affect it, it separates Palestinians from Canadians and from people who are listening. And it makes the issue out to be simply one of humanitarian, where they can just throw their hands up in the air. They can just be pushing for more humanitarian assistance rather than pushing for an end to Israel's colonial rule, rather than pushing for an end to the ethnic cleansing of Palestine. All things that Canada can and should be doing. When you step back and you look at Canadian foreign policy for many years was very much firmly on the side of international law, meaning that they don't accept the Israeli settlements. They don't accept Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. They don't accept the legality of Israeli settler terror. They don't accept this idea that there's a superior rights for people who are Jewish and inferior rights for Palestinians. They don't accept this idea that Palestinians have to remain forever as refugees. That's Canadian foreign policy. And yet it doesn't at all get reflected either in the policies that you see implemented on the ground, but also in the ways in which we, as people who are asked to comment, it doesn't even reflect in the ways in which the questions we're asked and how we're asked to comment. Again, it's always shaped as though somehow we are just a humanitarian issue, and if we just got more food into Gaza, then life would be better.
I've been seeing you sort of fixing headlines over the past 8 months just on Twitter and pointing out sort of this hypocrisy that we're seeing in the media. But there's also this sense that we're at a watershed moment in terms of media and how this is being portrayed, and a reckoning of sorts, and I don't know how much of that is generational, because you're hearing people like Jonathan Greenblatt from the ADL say, we're losing the youth. Congress is trying to shut down TikTok because Palestinians are able to show what's actually happening to them without it being filtered through, legacy media, etc. Can you talk to me a bit about these changes that you're actually seeing, regardless of, these drowning out of voices that's happening?
I think that for a very, very, very long time, that corporate media, mainstream media, as you call the legacy media, that they've gotten this issue wrong. And the reason that they've covered it incorrectly is that they've covered the issue of Palestinians through the lens of international relations. What do I mean by that? Mm-hmm. There's an Israeli prime minister and there's a Palestinian prime minister. There's an Israeli president and there's a Palestinian president. And when you cover it in terms of whether they had meetings, what a president said, what a prime minister said, you miss covering the main story, which is what is life like for the millions of Palestinians who are living under Israeli military rule? What's like for the 2 million Palestinians who are living as citizens within the state of Israel, unwanted citizens within the state of Israel? And what is life like for the 6 million Palestinians who are living in refugee camps or around the world, unable to return to their homeland because they're not Jewish? When you cover this issue as simply an international relations one, you miss that essential part of what it means to be Palestinian. You miss what it's like to live behind checkpoints. You miss what it's like to live behind a wall. You miss what it's like to have to live with settler terror. You miss what it's like to have your neighbors say very openly to you that the only reason that you're still in the country is because Ben Gurion didn't finish the job in 1948. You miss what it's like to be a Palestinian woman wearing hijab, riding a train and having people scream at you because you're speaking Arabic or because you're wearing a hijab. You miss what it's like to actually live in a place where you see the remnants of 1948, and yet you're denied the ability to even speak about the Nakba. You're denied the ability to commemorate the Nakba. You're told that you should be grateful that you're still around, or you miss what it's like to be a mother terrified that your teenage son is going to be picked up and thrown in prison for years on end without charge, without trial. So when you cover this issue as simply an international relations issue, which is very much the way that corporate media, legacy media, mainstream media has covered it, you miss what it's like to be a Palestinian. And so in comes the other forms of media. And, not all social media is very social, by the way. There are ways of making it not social through algorithms, through shadow bannings, through throttling, through all of the mechanisms that we all know, through you simply not choosing to follow people. But one thing that has happened with social media is that it has not only cut through the legacy media, the mainstream media, corporate media, but it's shown just how wrong the coverage has been for all of these years. When you see, for example, Palestinians in Gaza, irrespective of age, by the way, talking about what their lives are like during this period of genocide, you realize exactly how much it is that legacy media has missed during this period of time. And I don't think that it's just I don't think that it's an age issue, and I don't think that it's a generational issue. I think that what happened was that for all of these years, there was a throttle, there was a stronghold on the ways in which people either were censored or self-censored when it came to covering Palestine. So much so that we don't really know what it's like to live under military rule. I'm right here, Samira, right now in Ramallah. I'm in the city of Ramallah. And to get into Ramallah, I have to cross through a number of Israeli checkpoints. And again, I'm one of the privileged ones. When you hear about checkpoints, you're actually talking to people who are privileged because they have the ability to exit in and out. That is less than 10% of the Palestinian population that has that ability to enter, exit, in and out. Yes. And so I have to pass through a number of Israeli checkpoints. But it's not just Israeli checkpoints. Then you have to see a number of Israeli army bases along the way and Israeli settlers who are actually terrorizing Palestinians, who I personally have seen them drag people out of cars because they see that the Palestinian is driving in a Palestinian car, meaning that their license plate is a different color, or the person is wearing hijab, or they hear them speaking Arabic. That's what it's like for Palestinians to live each and every day through the violence of occupation. And unless you're willing to name that violence and describe that violence, there is no way that people can understand what it means to live as a Palestinian. And then there's no way for them to understand that they play a role in this and that they can shape and change policy to end this military occupation.
I want to come to that daily lived reality of what it means to live under occupation. There are so many similarities made between apartheid South Africa and the system that is in Israel, particularly in the occupied West Bank. And could you just talk through some of those similarities, legally speaking? I mean, you referenced administrative detention. For people who don't know, can you talk about what an administrative detainee is? And then some of those markers also, the different license plates, sterile roads, all of those makings of what an apartheid state is.
Sure. Let me first start with administrative detainees. I feel it's one of the most sanitized words that's out there. Because, what is an administrative detainee? It sounds so clean and so crisp, I'll tell you what it is. It is picking people up, usually in the middle of night, usually young kids. It starts with young kids, throwing them in prison with their family not knowing where they are, where they can be held without charge, without trial, for a period of 6 months, and then have that imprisonment, again, without charge, without trial, renewed indefinitely, but in 6-month periods. There are right now, I believe the number is over 3,000 Palestinians who are currently being held in Israeli prisons under this system of administrative detention. It's hostage taking, but in a different form. It's a legalized form of hostage taking. They're held without charge, without trial. Now, I can tell you that as somebody who lives here, pretty much every family that I have met, if not every family, has had somebody thrown in prison. I know a lot of people here. And so I don't think that there's one family that hasn't been touched by this system of incarceration. 40% of the male population has spent some time in an Israeli prison. 40%. That means 20% of the overall population, that's without women, has spent some time in an Israeli prison. And the system is so draconian that not only can a person be thrown in prison for a long period of time without trial, without charge, and for indefinite periods, but it's often accompanied by torture, with Israeli prison guards using torture as a means to extract confessions from people. So that's what it means to be, that's what this administrative detention system is about. But then to get into the system of how the similarities are between that and apartheid. Apartheid, as you know, and I'm sure your listeners know as well, is not just a system that it's not as simple as a system that says where you put up a sign that says this is for blacks only, this is for whites only. That's a very simplistic idea of apartheid. What it is it's the creation of an entire legal system where some people are privileged over others. And in the case of Israel, it's full-blown apartheid, so much so that South African anti-apartheid activists have said, this is worse than the apartheid that they lived under in South Africa. So how does it manifest itself? Mm-hmm. Through a number of means. First, you have laws that are directly on the books that privilege Israel's Jewish citizens over everybody else. And two laws that in particular that come to mind is one is called the law of return. And what that means is that it allows any person from anywhere around the world who is Jewish to come to Israel and automatically be granted citizenship. Meanwhile, Palestinians who are indigenous to the land don't get that similar right. For example, and it's affected my family personally. One of my aunts was born in Palestine. She was raised in Palestine. She got married in Palestine. She had her first child in Palestine. And in 1948, like 750,000 others, she fled Palestine, where she went to Jordan with her husband and her child. She ended up dying in a refugee camp in Jordan, never able to return to her homeland, even though she was born in Palestine, raised in Palestine, married in Palestine, had her first child in Palestine, is Palestinian. Why? Because she's not Jewish. Another law that is on the books, and this one should cause people's hair to stand on end, is one that is called an admissions committee law. And what that law says is that it allows communities that are of a certain size to determine whether a person who wants to live in that community is, quote unquote, acceptable. Now, when this case was argued before the Israeli Supreme Court, the case that was specifically argued was a Palestinian saying, I was denied the ability to live in a community because I'm Palestinian.
It sounds like a condo board on crack.
Exactly. But this is legalized. And the court came out and said, yes, people should have that ability to be able to choose who it is that's going to live in their communities. So remember, it's a system that is privileging people who are Jewish at the expense of Palestinians. So you have the law of return coupled with the denial of the right of return. You have, in its constitution, Israel says that it's a Jewish state. In the passage of the Jewish nation state law, which came out in 2017, they came out and said that Israel is the homeland for Jewish people only, and it provides self-determination for Jewish people only. Coupled with things like this admissions committee laws, and you can see how a whole system, and there's scores of them, there's 60 of them. I'm not going to go through all of them, but you can see how a system is created where it privileges some over the others. But then it manifests itself that's inside Israel, but it manifests itself inside the West Bank in other ways as well. One way is that there are two different legal systems in place in the West Bank. So if you assume, let's create a fictional incident in which there are two people who are, for example, throwing stones. They're both of the same age. One is named Moshe, who's Jewish Israeli, and the other is named Musa, who is a Palestinian. Let's assume that both Moshe, the Jewish Israeli, and Musa, the Palestinian, end up throwing stones. You'll see what ends up happening, because there are two different legal systems, that Moshe will be tried, if at all, in an Israeli civilian court system, where if he's ever convicted, which is very unlikely, he will get a very minor sentence. Turn the other side to Musa. Musa will be tried in an Israeli military court, denied the rights of that are given to others, like procedural rights. Hearings will be conducted in Hebrew. They will use secret evidence against him. He may be held in administrative detention, that system without charge or trial, indefinitely for a long period of time, just renewed every 6 months. And if he's convicted, and the likelihood is that he will be convicted because there is a 90% conviction rate, he will go to prison for a very long time. And so just in this same system, the same parcel of land, the same area, you have two different legal systems that mete out different punishments for the exact same crime, and not just different punishments, different rights afforded to these two different defendants based solely on their religion. One being Jewish with superior rights, and one being Palestinian, Christian or Muslim with inferior rights. But you also see it manifest itself physically. You see that there are cars, two different kinds of cars. There are cars that two different license plates. You'll see yellow-plated cars that can be driven by foreigners and Israeli passport holders, and versus white with green numbering for Palestinians only. A Palestinian is actually not even allowed to be in a yellow-plated car, even as a passenger. Yeah. There are roads that are entirely off limits to Palestinians in the West Bank, and entirely accessible for Israelis, for those riding those yellow-plated cars. And then it manifests itself even further. Palestinians are not allowed to travel from the airport that is the closest to them. They have to travel into a foreign country to go to Jordan to be able to travel. Travel bans are routinely placed on Palestinians so that they're denied the ability to travel. And the list goes on and on and on and on. And so you see that that there are a whole host of mechanisms, even so going down to the minutia of being able to who you can marry. You can actually get married to them, but you can't live with them is the problem. It gets down to that little, yeah. So, as Palestinians who hold Israeli citizenship, they can marry people from the West Bank. They can marry somebody from the Gaza Strip. But that person from Gaza can't live inside Israel. That person from the West Bank is not allowed to live inside Israel. And so the person who holds the Israeli passport may be able to go live in the West Bank. Maybe.
Wow.
They definitely can't live in Gaza. And so again, you see that even down to that, the aim is to try to control your life, like down to the nitty gritty. And these are a whole system that is just unknown to people because the way that they imagine and conceive of apartheid is a sign that says, drinking fountain for whites only, drinking fountain for blacks only. It's much worse than that. It's much more insidious than that. It's not as visible, but it's much more bureaucratic. And that is the foundation of the state of Israel, is creating a system of Jewish supremacy, whereby people who are Jewish have superior rights than those who are not Jewish and have much more inferior rights.
When you have these sort of clear signs of classification, which makes it very easy to distinguish who is who, and then behave accordingly towards that subsection of human, and the system that's so ingrained, why do you think people are so apprehensive in calling this system an apartheid system?
That's a great question, Samantha. So I think the big problem is twofold. One is that it doesn't look like the way that people imagine it to be. So I think that people are literally imagining that it's, the sign, drinking fountain for whites only, drinking fountain. I think people are imagining that when it doesn't exist. And because it doesn't exist, they automatically assume that it's not apartheid, but it is. But I think the bigger reason also is that Israel has done a job. It's done a job of selling itself as being a democracy. It's not. It's not a democracy. It's a Jewish state. And what that means is that it privileges people who are Jewish over those who are not Jewish. And so because it's sold itself in this way, it's taken people a very long time to wake up to this reality. Yeah, I remember, Samantha, for example, back in, I believe the year was 2001, when the Durban Conference on Racism happened. And it happened in Durban, South Africa, for a reason. It was the end of the apartheid regime. And they wanted to talk about apartheid. And Palestinian NGOs at the time, along with South African NGOs, were the ones who were saying what's happening in Palestine is apartheid. And we saw so many Palestinian NGOs come forward and say, this is apartheid, this is apartheid, this is apartheid. Now, sadly, it took 20 years before we had a mainstream, let's say, international human rights organization, Human Rights Watch, come forward and label it apartheid. That same year, B'Tselem did the same thing, the Israeli Human Rights Organization. And then the following year, Amnesty came on board. But the question is, why did it take, and now we have a consensus among all human rights groups, international and otherwise, that this is apartheid. But the question is, why did it take so long? And I think that the reason it took so long is that Palestinians have been so dehumanized that they don't even trust when we say what's happening to us, what is happening to us. They don't trust us.
I mean, the amount of, that relates back to the amount of fathers, Palestinian fathers I've seen holding up their children in front of cameras in the past 8 months, and still you're having people say things like, that's a doll. I mean, the Jerusalem Post later apologized for it, but ran an article saying that, that's not a real baby.
Yeah.
And so
we see it every day.
Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
We see that every day, Samira. And, there's also the dehumanization is so deep because it's not, when we die, they blame us for our own deaths. When they kill us, they act as though these are dolls. Like, even our death isn't real. None of it is real for them. And then it goes down to the level, a much more sanitized way, but also dehumanizing, is you'll hear people say, women and children, 70% of women and children. 70% of those killed are women and children. That's a shocking statistic. But what's also shocking is that we presume that each and every male is somehow complicit, or somehow we presume that every single male is a legitimate target, that they're a combatant. And yet, when I see these pictures and these videos that are coming out of Gaza, it's the men that you see, they're digging their children and their neighbors and their friends out of the rubble. It's them who are consoling their kids and saying, it's okay, tomorrow's going to be better. It's the men who you see that are trying to, give them love and hope. And yet all that we can do is turn them into a statistic, or even like completely ignore them, by saying 70% of those killed are women and children. Yes, shocking statistic, but 100% of those who've been killed are humans. And that's the part that it's so dehumanizing when you have to go through and explain to people that genocide should just not be allowed in this day and age, and that's what we're living through.
I want to come back to you mentioning that it took 20 years for, well-known human rights organizations to call it an apartheid system. And I distinctly remember during that time, it was 2021, Israel was bombing Gaza in May of 2021. And I think it was June 2021 that the Human Rights Watch report came, but nobody covered it here in the Canadian media.
Yeah.
None of them. And I distinctly remember pitching it and thinking to myself, if this was about China, if this was about anywhere else being called, an apartheid state. I mean, Amnesty also put out a report about the Uyghurs during that time, which we covered plenty, rightly so. But nobody in the Canadian media landscape touched these reports by Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International. I want to come to the encampments that you're seeing around the world.
Yeah.
These universities. I found out that you also attended the University of Toronto.
I did.
Which was also my alma mater. I did Middle Eastern studies there.
Me too.
Master's in modern Middle Eastern history. And the students there yesterday held their own convocation for all of the students in Gaza who won't be graduating, and the hundreds of students that have been killed. I just want to ask you, do you have any message for those students at the University of Toronto and what they're doing?
Oh God, where do I begin? So recently I went to a couple of the encampments in New York City. And I said to them, and this is the same message, is that it's such a powerful, powerful, powerful message and powerful image to be seeing people standing in solidarity and trying to make sure that the world does not turn a blind eye to what is happening in Gaza, to what Israel's doing in Gaza. And it's so powerful because, Samira, to live in Palestine is a very lonely experience. You live behind walls. You live behind checkpoints. You live often feeling as though you're screaming into the wind and nobody can hear you. If you're in Gaza, you live blockaded. This is even before October the 7th. You live blockaded, besieged, unable to leave, unable to connect. And so it's a very lonely experience. You're dehumanized, second-guessed, questioned. Your experience is never listened to. It's always somebody else's experience is much more superior, always. And so to live as a Palestinian is a very lonely experience. To see those encampments we feel heard, we feel seen. It makes me so proud to see how much energy these students are putting into making sure that the world does not turn a blind eye to what Israel is doing in Gaza. And again, it's not just Israel. It's Israel, it's the United States, and it's each and every country that has not stepped forward and stopped Israel. And they have the ability to stop Israel, whether it's by pushing for boycotts against Israel, whether it's placing sanctions on Israel, whether it's through an arms embargo on Israel, whether it's from divesting from Israel. All of these things are measures that people can do, and the Canadian government can do, and universities can do. And just seeing those students and their supporters day after day after day make it clear that they have not forgotten us, but that they're speaking on our behalf when we can't speak any longer it's empowering. I feel seen, I feel heard, and I'm just so proud of them. I was a student at U of T, as were you, and at the time that I was there, it was very difficult to be a Palestinian. The administration went out of its way to try to crush Palestinian voices. I remember at one point in time, I was part of something called the Middle East Forum, and we actually had a publication called the Mizan, and the university often tried to portray us as though we were the Jordanian students. Even saying that we were Palestinian students was something that was very much shunned upon, and so frowned upon. Excuse me. And so to see these students now I'm just so proud of them. I'm so proud of them, and as I said, I feel seen, I feel heard, and thank you.
Yeah, I told some of them that I was speaking to you, and they were quite they were really blown away. So just, I know that to me, it's wild that there are these 18 and 19-year-olds who are characterized as, just these kids. They don't know what they're talking about, or, they're brainwashed, useful idiots, but they're so bright, actually.
Of course they are. Of course they are. That's their whole point. Look, when you reduce these students to kids, it's a way of infantilizing them. It's a way of turning them into people who aren't thinking, who aren't seeing, who aren't feeling, but they're the opposite. They're bright. They're thinking, they're seeing, they're feeling. They're seeing that genocide should not be allowed in the year 20. It shouldn't be allowed, period, but certainly not in this day and age. We shouldn't be seeing kids die of starvation when there is food, plenty of it, just a few kilometers away. There shouldn't be. We shouldn't be seeing these images of Israeli settlers taking over trucks of humanitarian aid and destroying the food so that it doesn't make it into Gaza. We shouldn't be living in a world where Israelis are allowed to erect a bouncy castle. I don't know if you know this, but they've erected a bouncy castle in front of the place where aid goes into Gaza, so as to prevent aid from getting in. And not only bouncy castle, but popcorn and cotton candy distributed, because our genocide is their entertainment. I mean, this is what these students are seeing. And they're smart enough to know that that's not the way that humanity should be working. And they're courageous enough to be putting themselves on the line because they know that they want to see a different world, a world that doesn't allow genocide to take place without people being held accountable, without stopping it. They want to be able to stand up and say, we did what we could in the face of this genocide. And again, I can't tell you how proud I am. I cannot tell you how proud I am of them, and how inspired I am and how thankful I am, because they have lifted voices at a time where we cannot speak any longer. We cannot speak. They've taken away our voices. You know, my mom, she always has these great sayings, and one of the things that she says, and my late father used to say the same, is that there's a reason that we have choirs. And one of the reasons is so that somebody else can continue to carry the tune when you have to pause and take a breath. And so they're continuing to carry on the tune at a time when some of us need to pause and take a breath, because we've been screaming for such a long period of time.
Diana, how do you think we'll look back on this time in 20 years, 30 years?
You know, I think a lot of people are going to be hanging their heads in shame. I think a few things are going to happen. One is Israel's not going to be looking good. And it doesn't look good now. Imagine in 20 years' time when the full enormity of what Israel has done comes to light. Because I don't think we've seen even 1% of this. Israel's not going to look good. Canada's not going to look good. The United States is definitely not going to look good. And all of the people who stayed silent are also going to have a lot to account for. But I think another thing is also going to happen, and you might remember this, Samira, but when the apartheid regime fell in South Africa, it became hard-pressed to find somebody who was an apartheid supporter. Remember? Like now, here we are, 30 years after the fall of apartheid. And try finding somebody who says, yeah, that was a good thing. Yeah, that's what I think is going to happen. I think that in that period of time, we're going to say, wow, they really did that. And now, I was never an Israel supporter. You know, the people who are the biggest and the loudest cheerleaders for Israel are going to magically transform themselves into being the people who champion Palestinian rights. You know, like the Piers Morgan effect. We saw Piers Morgan from early on being Israel's cheerleader, for lack of a better term. And now he's beginning to realize that maybe dropping a 2,000-pound bomb on a refugee camp is not a good thing.
It's interesting. I was speaking to Fatima Hassan, who's a South African human rights lawyer. She actually visited the encampment at the University of Toronto. And she said the same thing. You'd be hard-pressed to find anyone who supports South Africa today. But as a friend of mine recently said, that the screenshots are not going to be very kind to a lot of people.
That's the difference between today and 30 years ago. There are a lot of screenshots. And I think that even you see this happening in real time with people like Bernie Sanders, who very early on championed Israel's attack on Gaza, and are now changing their tune to saying we shouldn't be giving more arms to Benjamin Netanyahu, but still hasn't gone the full distance of saying that Israel must be held to account and that the United States must be held to account. he still has not apologized for supporting the attack on Gaza in the early days. And we knew where it was leading. I mean, anybody who has watched this knows exactly what they were going to do. We knew that they were going to carry out a very brutal attack. It's like taking and we knew it because we live it, and we heard what they said in the immediate aftermath. They weren't shy about saying that they were going to carry out genocide. And so, the screenshots are not going to be kind. Yeah.
Diana, thank you so much for speaking with me. I really appreciate it.
My pleasure, Samira. My pleasure.